Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location, Midwest USA, with some more historical insights for you this Friday. I thought that since last week's episode was about the history of the American Fire Department, I thought the history of American law enforcement would be a logical next step. This also has special meaning to me because I have good friends of mine who are in law enforcement. Tom and Trey, if you're listening to this, hello. And I can think of no better place to begin than the oldest recognized law enforcement official, and that, of course, is the sheriff. And the office of sheriff is very, very old. And once again, we have to look to pre American times for the true history of the sheriff. In jolly old England, the sheriff came about around the 9th century, and this makes it the oldest continuing non military law enforcement entity in the world. Now, during the days of early England, the land was divided into geographical areas set between the two individual kings. These areas were called shires. And with each shire, there was an individual called a reeve, which meant guardian. And this individual was originally selected by the serfs to be their informal social and governmental leader. The kings of the time observed how influential this person was within the serf community and soon incorporated that position into the governmental structure. The reeve soon became the king's appointed representative to protect the king's interests and act as a mediator with the people of his particular shire. Through time and usage, the words shire and reeve came together to become shire reeve, which of course means guardian of the shire, and eventually became the word sheriff. The office of sheriff grew in importance with increasing responsibilities up to and through the Norman invasion of England in 1066. And the duties of sheriff include keeping the peace, collecting taxes, maintaining jails, arresting fugitives, maintaining a list of wanted criminals, and serving the orders and writs for the king's court. And interestingly, most of the duties are still the foundation of sheriff's responsibilities in the United States, but obviously we don't have kings. And the responsibilities of the office of sheriff in England usually kind of ebbed and flowed depending on the mood and needs of kings and government. This changed, however, in 1215, when the Magna Carta was signed by King John. The document contained 63 clauses, and 27 of them were related to the restrictions upon as well as the responsibilities of the county sheriff. Through the passage of time, the English sheriff began to lose responsibility and power, and by the early 1800s, it became largely ceremonial, as it remains today in England. However, the concept of sheriff, because of the vast British Empire, was exported to places such as Canada, Australia, India, and of course, the American colonies. In America, the office was modified over a period of time to fit democratic ideas. When the Dutch settled the area called New Amsterdam, which would later be called New York City in 1626, the Dutch version of a sheriff was called a schout. And when the English claimed the land, the schout became the sheriff. And in other American colonies, following the pattern of English government, sheriffs were appointed. And the first sheriff in America is believed to be Captain William Stone, who was appointed in 1634 for the Shire of New Hampton in the colony of Virginia. And the first elected sheriff was William Waters in 1652 in the same shire. Shire was used in many of the colonies before the word county replaced it. The sheriff's office in America was much different from its English counterpart. It was much less social, had less judicial influence, and was much more responsive to individuals than the English counterpart. The duties of the early American sheriff were similar in many ways to its English forerunner, which centered on court-related duties such as security and warrants, protection of citizens, maintaining the jail, and collecting taxes. As the nation expanded westward, the office of sheriff continued to be a significant part of law enforcement. In 1776, Pennsylvania and New Jersey adopted the office of sheriff in their constitution. The Ohio Constitution called for the election of the county sheriff in 1802, and then state by state, the democratic election of the sheriff became not only a tradition, but in most states, a constitutional requirement. And so, county law enforcement spread like wildfire. And on April the 29th, 1786, Sheriff Benjamin Branch of Chesterfield County, Virginia, died when he was thrown off his horse, and he became the first known law enforcement officer to be killed in the line of duty. Law enforcement would reach the federal level on September the 24th, 1789. That was when the United States Congress created the first federal law enforcement officer, the United States Marshal, and 13 U.S. Marshals were appointed by then-President George Washington. As American society began to move westward in the frontier regions of the United States in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a new form of law enforcement arose, well, law enforcement really in quotes, and that was the vigilante. In areas where a formal justice system had yet to be established, it was not uncommon for citizens, called regulators, to band together in committees of vigilance to combat crime and to introduce order where none existed. This became known as vigilantism or vigilantes. And this now brings us to more organized law enforcement. And if you remember the first ever episode of Bowtie Talks, then you would know that when the Irish immigrants first came here, they were not necessarily welcome with open arms. During the mid-19th century, large numbers of immigrants from Germany and Ireland were beginning to settle in the steadily growing urban centers of New York and Boston. Their cultures and lifestyles originally offended the sensibilities of Americans whose families mainly came from England and the Netherlands. So the existence of large immigrant populations in the crowded cities of the East was seen as a threat to the very fabric of American society. And I'm sure a lot of the reticence, and this was when anti-Irish sentiment was at its height in America. And eventually the political, economic, and social dominance of Americans of English and Dutch descent was eroded. However, crime, rioting, and other disturbances became endemic in the cities, and so a response to the growing rate came twofold. The constable and night watch system was tried, and voluntary citizens groups were encouraged to solve urban problems. And reformers distributed religious tracts and Bibles, started Sunday schools, created such organizations as the Young Man Christians Association, and presented themselves as moral examples to immigrants and the poor. By the mid-19th century, middle-class frustration with the deterioration of the cities had led to the passage of laws regulating public behavior and creating new public institutions of social control and coercion. So the first American police department was established in New York City in 1844. Other cities soon followed: New Orleans, Louisiana, and Cincinnati, Ohio in 1852, Boston and Philadelphia in 1854, Chicago, Illinois, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1855, and Baltimore, Maryland, and Newark, New Jersey in 1857. These early police departments all used the London Metropolitan Police as a model. Like the Metropolitan Police Force, American police was organized in a semi-military command structure. Their main task was to prevent crime and disorder, and they provided a wide array of other public services. At this time, there were also no detectives. And ironically, one of the groups of immigrants who were seen as responsible for the early crime raves would later make up a large percentage of police departments. And of course, I am talking about the Irish. If you remember my first podcast episode, then you will know that when the Irish first came over here, most jobs would not take them. Most of the jobs that Irish men would receive would be public service jobs. That is, police and fire department work. However, there has to be a beginning to all these things, and for the Irish cop, we have to look to Boston of all places. In 1851, an Irishman named Barney McGinniskin joined the Boston Police Department. And interestingly, people of Irish ancestry during this time were barred from many types of work, including law enforcement. And a local newspaper called the Boston Pilot wrote at the time, "He is the first Irishman that ever carried the stick of a policeman anywhere in this country, and meetings have been held to protect against this appointment." Him being hired was protested by the Know Nothing political party, which I talked about during my first episode of Bowtie Talks. It was an anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, and anti-immigration themed political party. As a result, the mayor of Boston at the time ordered the city marshal to gather information about the applicant. After making inquiries, the marshal found that the man was 42 years old, had been 22 years in the country, and had a reputation of being a temperate and quiet man. And with the support of the mayor, Officer McGinniskin was hired. However, his time as a police officer was sadly short-lived. During the 1854 Boston elections, the Know Nothing Party gained political influence, and so he was dismissed just 3 years after joining the police force. It was an unfortunate turn of events for a man who, by most accounts, was a good police officer. However, political tides in Boston, Massachusetts, and other big cities in the United States would soon shift. However, political tides would change in Boston and other major American cities. Many new Irish-born Americans began exercising the right to vote, and they found they had better leverage to advocate for job opportunities. During the second half of the 19th century, just a few decades after McGinniskin's termination, big city police departments like Boston and New York were significantly, if not mostly, Irish-American. And law enforcement would eventually make its way westward in 1835, when Texas created what was later to become the Texas Rangers, and to this day it is the oldest statewide law enforcement agency in this country. And in 1857, the city of Baltimore, Maryland, became the first police department to issue pistols to their officers. In 1858, the police departments of Boston, Massachusetts, and Chicago, Illinois would become the first police departments to issue uniforms to their officers. 1850s would also see the beginning of a new form of police work, and that, of course, is detective policing. Crime investigation was not a central function of the early preventive police departments in the United States. And despite the high hopes of reformers when they created the police forces, the number of preventable crimes was limited. As crimes continued occurring, police forces were pressured into accepting responsibility for investigations and creating detective units. The London Metropolitan Police established the first detective branch in 1842. That unit became the Criminal Investigations Department in 1878. Detective units were later established in the police departments of many American cities, including New York City in 1857 and Chicago in 1861. However, as detective work was becoming more common, it brought the bane of police corruption. Chicago disbanded its criminal investigative division in 1864, and so did Boston in 1870. And New York City suffered major scandals in 1877, all as a consequence of corruption. And realizing that they needed investigative officers, these cities soon reconstructed their investigative units, but significant improvement in the professional conduct of detectives did not happen until well into the 20th century. 1893 saw the formation of the first national police group, the National Chiefs of Police Union, which would later become the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and for the first time, police leaders met regularly to share ideas. The 1900s saw an early technical advancement in police work, and that, of course, is fingerprinting. In 1902, fingerprinting was first used in the United States by law enforcement, and much like firemen, policemen, an iconic symbol of the police is the police dog. However, I am sad to say that the police dog does have some relatively grim origins. In 1907, a 15-year-old girl named Amelia Staffeld was murdered in Elmhurst, New York. This inspired the New York Police Administration to consider using dogs for their police work. The man who murdered young Amanda was caught a few days later, and they learned that a man named Henry Becker remained in Elmhurst for a day or so after the murder. If they had caught him then, they could have prevented his other crimes. The police commissioner wanted to investigate whether a dog could have helped. He knew that a man on his force, Lieutenant George R. Wakefield, was also very interested in using dogs on the police force. And since the murderer remained in Elmhurst, the commissioner and Lieutenant Wakefield thought that if they had a bloodhound, they could have caught Henry Becker sooner. A kennel near Poughkeepsie, New York, specialized in raising and training bloodhounds. The commissioner sent Lieutenant Wakefield to investigate whether they should add a bloodhound to the force. And when Wakefield returned from Poughkeepsie, he had depressing news. Based on what he learned about bloodhounds, he determined that the dogs would not be well suited to work in the city. The streets are layered with smells, and since criminals sometimes escape by subway, it would be difficult for dogs to retain the scent, and this would leave the bloodhound and policeman at a dead end. But the commissioner and Lieutenant Wakefield remained hopeful about using police dogs. A program in Ghent, Belgium was receiving attention for the job they were doing, training dogs to accompany constables for night patrol. The commissioner funded Wakefield to go to Belgium and learn more. Now, this program started in 1902. The school created a 4-month training program. The dogs were taught the tasks they would need: seek, attack, and then stop and hold. At the time, the dogs were not expected to bite their victims, so they wore loose-fitting muzzles so they could still bark but not bite. And since the dogs wore muzzles, they needed to learn another way to catch and bring down their victim. Most used a system that involved chasing down the person and wrapping their front paws around the fellow's legs to bring him down. The dogs were then trained to stand on the person and bark to alert their dog handler. Lieutenant Wakefield spent several weeks in Ghent working with some dogs and going through training himself. In the final analysis, he felt that these dogs could be helpful in New York City. When Lieutenant Wakefield had the all right to bring dogs back to the U.S., he was disappointed to learn that there were no trained dogs available for purchase. The Paris Police Department was a big proponent of police dogs and had just purchased 400 of them. His next step was locating dogs that could be trained. He finally made a deal for 5 6-month-old dogs. He paid $10 for each dog and another 10 for transatlantic travel for each dog. There was also an import tax of $2. This brought the grand total for each untrained dog to $22. George Wakefield used transatlantic travel via shipboard to work on training the dogs. They were still young. The dogs still needed to learn basic commands and have them reinforced. Unfortunately, one of the dogs died before the end of the trip. Upon landing in New York, Wakefield and his charges were sent to a dilapidated mansion in Fort Washington Park in Washington Heights, which is a section of Manhattan. Since they were one dog short, Wakefield replaced it with a young Airedale named Jim. The other dogs were Nogi, Max, Donna, and Lady. Lieutenant Wakefield organized a 3-month training program to operate from Fort Washington Park. A patrolman known to be good with dogs, moved into his mansion with his family to assist Wakefield. The dining room was set up with stalls where the dogs lived when they weren't working or in supervised play. The program, like the one in Ghent, featured positive reinforcement. Care and feeding of the animals was only done by men in uniform. That way, the dogs learned the people in uniform were their friends and authority figures. People in civilian clothes were potentially suspect. The plan was for these dogs to work at night patrol. They were taught 4 commands: search, attack, heel, and down. Down was the command for the dog to back off and let the officer take over. When searching a house, the process was for a policeman to take the front of the house, sending the dog to search the yard, fields, and hedges. An added benefit to the program was the police saw that the dogs were intimidating to the public. This alone helped reduce crime because people were nervous about what the dogs might do, and rightfully so. As training methods advanced, sound was one of the elements added. When the dogs were housed in kennels, audio could be piped in. By playing recorded sounds of thunderstorms, whirring car engines, and exploding bombs, it helped the dogs acclimate to what might happen on the street. This program soon grew because by 1911, New York was using 16 dogs for patrol in residential districts on Long Island. These dogs were assigned territories and could run on their own with their police handler nearby. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., the dogs brought down potential thieves in the area. The dog was to stand on the person, barking until their handler arrived. And today, there are approximately 50,000 active police canines in the United States. Police work, dogs are used for everything from drug and bomb detection to helping locate missing people. That, I think I may have to call this a night. What have we learned? Well, we've learned that the police force has had a definite hand in American society, and we should thank them. So thank you to all our policemen and women out there. Thank you so much. And with that, I say goodbye and God bless.